I mean, that's just podcast, the board game. That's not unique to us.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Flux.
I'm Ben McKenzie.
Welcome to Pratchett, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast.
Each month, we usually discuss one of Terry Pratchett's books or short stories with a special guest.
This month, we were going postal after reading so many books, so we decided to play a board game instead, called CLACKS. Now, normally I'd do a pun about that, but because not that many people would be familiar with it, I didn't want to leave them in the dark.
Okay. And our two returning guests are entertainer and educator Nicholas J. Johnson. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much for having me.
And comedian, screenwriter, and performer Lawrence Leung. Welcome, Lawrence.
Hello. It's great to be back.
Well, we thought it was so appropriate to get the two of you back because not only do you like puzzles and games, but you also were our guests for the book on which this game is based, Going Postal. We haven't seen you since then. It's been ages. How are you both?
That is the long dramatic pause of a couple of tired middle-aged dads who've just wondering how we're going to summon up the energy to lie.
Don't lie.
I'm tired. How are you, Lawrence?
I'm pretty tired too. I just put the kids to bed and jumped online to recall a book that I can't remember from many, many years ago. But I do remember having had read it twice, once as a teenager and once before this podcast many moons ago, and thinking that it was a fantastic book. However unmemorable it may be now.
Maybe you're just purging your brain of the word moist.
Yes, that would be it.
I wonder, because I have a terrible memory just for everything in life, and I often will forget books, a few weeks after I've read them. And if someone was to ask me about a book that I've just read, I couldn't tell you the name of the characters or the story or anything. And it makes me feel a little guilty. Do you think it's important to remember the books that you have read? Because someone once said to me, hey, don't worry about it. You don't remember all the meals that you've ever eaten, but still they're a part of you, So are we supposed to be remembering books?
I think we remember the important bits of them, and different books offer different things. Sometimes you sort of pick up a cadence of writing or a type of humor or a good line or insight into a personality based off a character, and you don't necessarily remember the plot or everything in it, but the key things that speak to you from a book, if it's good or worthwhile, they'll stick with you in a way that the whole book might not. And I also feel like we store most books, like most things like film and stuff, in not quite the front of our brain, but sort of at the side, so that you get that thing where if you read it again, you're like, oh, wait, I remember this thing, and you start to unlock different parts of it as you go along. So it's not accessible immediately, I think, but the important parts stick, is how I feel.
I think it's important to remember books if you're running a podcast about said book.
Yeah. And look, I think that's partly my role on the podcast. But also, I'll be honest, I actually am slightly envious of people who don't have that sort of detailed memory of the fiction that they ingest, because I so rarely go back and rewatch or reread things unless there's something very, very dear to my heart, because I'm like, but I remember what happened, unless it's been a very long time, unless it's been 10 years or so since I've read a book. I usually am reading it going, yep. And I would love that, because some of my favorite books I'd love to read again, because I find the surprise of not knowing what's going to happen next is a big part of the enjoyment for me. I'm a big spoiler phobe in that respect. So I think that would be delightful, go back and then I'd probably reread a bunch of Terry Pratchett books every year, because I'm like, I don't remember any of the jokes. This will be great. Whereas now, a lot of these ones I haven't read for 20 years or more. But that's good. It means I don't remember them too well.
And I guess also where this idea of you're going to read hundreds of books in your lifetime is a fairly new invention. It is not like 100 years ago you would have 3 books in the house and you would just reread those same, your Bible and your Book of Common Prayer, and I don't know what the other one would be, and you just reread those same books over and over again. And so like it's not our fault, it's society. It's capitalism. It's capitalism making us buy all of these books.
As a child, I read the book of how beautiful table settings quite a lot of times.
Yeah.
Which means but at a formative age, that means I can fold napkins beautifully in about 5 different styles. So that wasn't really what you're talking about. I just wanted to boast, and I have. So that's me done.
And what a lovely table setting you have around you right now.
Well, thank you for noticing.
I find everyone's got some kind of weird book, often like a coffee table book that their parents owned or something, that they read in their youth a lot. I remember mine was like a craft book, and it was sort of this just general stuff you can make at home, kind of for your kids. And it had all kinds of projects in it. And I think I only ever made 2 of them, but one of them was like a zither, like a musical instrument, which wasn't very good, and I didn't know how to tune it. But we made it. My mum helped me, I think. I certainly didn't do it by myself.
What did you make it out of?
Oh, wood.
Oh, you properly made it. It wasn't here's some rubber bands and a toilet roll kind of thing. It was you properly made it.
Yeah, but we never painted it. I remember it was always just the plain wood, whereas the one in the book was nicely painted and it had a little pattern around the big, I'm just going to say hole because I can't remember the right word for the sound hole.
No, it's the sound hole. It's the sound hole. That's it. Yeah.
The mouth.
Yeah. The mouth.
Somehow that's worse.
Yeah. The yaw. The craw.
The craw. Yeah, okay. The craw of the zither. That sounds like a book that would win a Pulitzer Prize or something, doesn't it?
Yeah, I cut that out of the podcast so I can write it and win a Pulitzer Prize.
Okay, sorry, Liz.
I do like the title for a podcast being Mouth Hole.
This is I teach podcasting now. I don't know if I've talked about this on the podcast, but I teach podcasting, and one of the things that we talk about in class is should you put the word podcast in the title of your podcast? I'm generally of the opinion no. It's most of the time it's redundant, but sometimes there's a good reason to do it. And I wonder if mouth hole is somewhere on that spectrum.
The mouth hole podcast is worse. And everything just makes it.
It's a mouthful to say.
Maybe it's a podcast for ear, nose, and throat surgeons or something.
So we've got moist and mouth hole as words we regret saying too many times on this episode.
It's probably just as well that really there's just one sequence in the book that this game represents, so we don't have to remember any of the other stuff.
Yeah, we didn't even do that version of the game.
No. Although I did play it without you, so we could talk about it a little bit.
You played without us?
I did. Well, you weren't there. I didn't have much option.
Well, it'd be worse if you played without us and we weren't there.
That would be much worse, I agree. Shall we talk about the game?
Yes.
Sure.
I can kick us off now. When we read a book, we traditionally start with a reading of the blurb. I thought I could read the blurb on the back of the box. And this is the original edition, which is the one we played. There is a collector's edition that came out a few years later.
What's the difference between the collector's edition and the original?
Well, mostly it has new box art. It has some plastic miniatures for some of the parts instead of the little wooden pieces. And it has a couple of extra cards of each of the fault report cards, incident report cards, and operator's log cards. And there's 2 more of them in the collector's edition of each one of those. So you got a little bit more variety in the kind of cards that you might get. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same. This is the blurb on the back of the box for CLACKS, a Discworld board game, or also it says a Discworld puzzle game. It's got a lot of descriptions of itself. Anyway, this is what it says. CLACKS, the fastest non-magical messaging system on the Discworld. Using a semaphore system of shuttered lamps on top of high towers, the Grand Trunk Semaphore Company has revolutionized long-distance communications on the Discworld. Their network of towers covers most of the unnamed continent, but now the old postal service is fighting back. Driven by the determination of newly volunteered postmaster Moist von Lipwig, the Ankh-Morpork post office has challenged the CLACKS operators to a race from Ankh-Morpork to Genua. Play against your friends and claim the title of fastest CLACKS operator on the line, or play together as a team to win the race across the Discworld and prove that CLACKS is here to stay. So it's pretty, I mean, that sounds pretty action-packed. But I also like that, you know, the sort of the fictional introduction talks about how it's all about the race, but then when it actually comes to saying what you do, they've put the play against your friends version first, which is the version that we played together. Since this episode was recorded, I've tracked down a copy of the Collector's Edition, or more correctly, the Anniversary Edition, as it was originally planned to be released for the game's 5th anniversary in 2020. The text on the back is pretty much identical, except for an altered list of components to account for the differences between the two editions, and that the cooperative mode is now listed before the competitive one at the end of the blurb.
But the job interview version.
Yes, because that is the fiction that it has in the rulebook, which is designed on the cover of the rulebook to look like an actual operations manual for a CLACKS tower from the Discworld. It's quite delightful. But it describes that if you're playing against other players, there's only so many jobs going for CLACKS operators. So if you want that job, you better prove that you're the best.
Capitalism again.
Yeah. It says here, with the forthcoming transmission race coming up against the Ankh-Morpork Postal Service, the Grand Trunk is hiring only the very best CLACKS operators to work on the network. Have you got what it takes to master one of the new CLACKS exchanges? Can you be the fastest and shrewdest CLACKS operator on the disk? And the answer to that, if you're Liz, is yes. Isn't it, Liz?
Yes, because I unexpectedly won. Despite, because we'll get into the mechanics of it, but there's this thing where if you win, the way you win is you were each assigned a word at the beginning of the game, and you have to try and convey that word letter by letter on your turns. So if you finish your word, you win, but there's an opportunity for the person whose turn is after you to sabotage you, to undo your win, and you keep going. So that had happened at least once or twice before it came to me. And I managed to make my last letter, and then I was like, okay, great, so how do we sabotage me? And everyone was like, no, don't try and sabotage yourself. And I was like, no, but it's the game. And then no one could sabotage me, and I won. So that was pure skill and not luck.
We did really embrace the competitive nature of this version of the game.
Well, it did go both ways, because it was... I think we kept wanting to play collaboratively, but every so often you'd be like, hey, there's these cards. You can absolutely just mess up someone's turn, but I'll also help them during it. So, I'm a good person, but a bad person at the same time. It's very morally confusing.
Yeah, I struggled with it as well. I think also when it got towards the end, where it was, I think we all had 4 letters and we're just sort of each trying to get our last letter.
Except Ben.
Except for Ben. I didn't want to say that, but except for Ben. It felt like we were really, circling the drain. It felt like the last 20 minutes of playing Mousetrap when the thing's all built and everyone's you're just trying to get a mouse underneath the thing and people just want the game to be over. And it felt a little bit like that. Like, what's going to make this, what's going to get us over the finish line?
Now, I wanted to keep playing. And again, I say this every time we do a board game thing. I come in going, this is going to be too difficult. I don't understand how to play board games. I don't understand how I'm going to learn how to do this. And the first round's going to be so tricky while I'm just learning it. And then you start playing and it's great. And then as it was winding down, I was like, oh no, we're not going to get to play it again. And I've only got one thing. So
like a true winner of the game.
Yeah. I, who won the game, had a great time.
And I would play it again. No reason.
I think the sign of a good game is how well it simulates the world that it's trying to be. So this is a simulator for a Semaphore postal, telegraph system. And in the version of the game that we were playing, it was kind of an audition, a job interview. And so we're competing against each other to be the best CLACKS operator. It's already quite a long bow to draw, considering this technology is quite fanciful and far-fetched. But then to try to translate that into a working game that makes sense was a bit of a stretch, but I think they achieved it. It is a puzzle. You read on the box there, Ben, that it is a puzzle game because it very much feels like trying to solve a puzzle, because it's all about getting configurations of lights to turn it on and off, to almost be a cryptologist to figure out a code. And so we're essentially coding things, constantly referring to a little cryptology crib sheet and turning tokens around, and then forgetting. Well, for me, I found myself forgetting what I was doing at times because there was a lot of waiting around before it was your turn.
Yes.
In a lot of games, there's a good part of strategizing and trying to go planning ahead, but there wasn't much chance to plan ahead here, because every time someone switched on and off the lights, it would completely change the board, and then you couldn't really plan ahead. You just had to wait till everyone else had a turn and then see what the gameplay was in front of you and just play what was in front of you. So I'm not sure at the moment whether it felt like there was much strategy going on. There was a lot of luck and very much a lot of waiting for everyone else to play their turn.
Yeah, I think a lot of the helping that went on was perhaps more out of boredom than it was out of camaraderie. Like we were just like, yeah, come on, let's help each other because we want to keep the game moving. I think as far as the simulation thing goes, to me in the books, the core of the CLACKS is one, that it's this complex kind of binary system of communication. And the other is the towers that you have, it's being transferred from tower to tower to tower, like in Lord of the Rings with the flames going up, and that message keeps getting relayed across. And in the version we played, at least, there wasn't, the towers were irrelevant. It was really just decoding. And the code itself wasn't really very complicated. It was it looked essentially like Braille. And the problems, like you said, it was essentially every 5 minutes you got to solve a puzzle that wasn't that difficult once you sort of figured out the basics of how to solve it. It was really just sort of, I'll spend a few minutes and see whether this is solvable or not. And you go, oh, this isn't solvable. Oh, well, my turn's over. Let's move on to the next player. And I don't feel like either of those really kind of, it didn't bring to life the CLACKS of the books.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to design our version of it, how would we simulate it? Would we have torches, like, flashlights? Would we be on opposite sides of the room? Maybe up trees? Just throwing it out there.
I mean, I have made that game with some other people. I can't remember. I'm trying to remember. This is such a long time ago. So, listener, if you are not familiar with this, I used to run a live games company in Melbourne called Pop-Up Playground with some other people. And one year for the Free Play Independent Games Festival, one of the games that we had was all about transmitting codes between members of the same team, and you were allowed to do it kind of any way you wanted. You had from memory, this is, again, we only ran this game once, so there were a lot of games that we created. This happens with live game companies, because you build this thing for a particular event, you run it at the event, and then it doesn't exist as a physical artifact. It's like a live performance. You do it and then it's over. But I think it was called Wiki Sneaks. That's right. It had a name and everything. Yeah. And the point was you had a bit of, in your team, you had a little bit of conferring time to come up with your own code, and you could use like lights. And I think there were a couple other things, because it was played in the evening outside, and you had to transmit a code from some of your team members to some of your other team members. And the point was to transmit it accurately, but also in a way that wouldn't be intercepted by other teams, because if another team managed to intercept your code and decipher it, they could steal your points. So that I hadn't actually thought about that till you asked that question, Lawrence, but I kind of have made that game.
So yours is the collector's edition.
Yeah, I guess so. It wasn't specifically based on the CLACKS from the books, because it was me and Jess Kilby. I think we designed that one together, if I remember rightly. I'm going to have to look this up because I might be remembering this wrong, but I'm pretty sure we designed it together for that festival, and it was pretty good. It worked. People had fun, but it was maybe a little bit complicated. And I think, that's something we could say about this game too. Look, we should describe the basic mechanics of it a little bit more for listeners who haven't played it. So the board, there is a board, and it has a 4x4 grid that these little tokens sit on, and the tokens represent the lights. So it's a big 4x4 grid of individual lights represented by little tokens that can be turned on or off. And whichever side you're sitting on, that's the orientation of the board for you. So whatever is up to you is up for your Clacks towers. And in that 4x4 grid, you can divide it up into 6 different 2x3 Clacks towers worth of lights. So a Clacks tower is like 3 rows of 2 lights, if you can imagine that. So 2 across and 3 down. If you think about it like a Lego piece, that's 2 wide and 3 long, and then set it upways. That's what it looks like. With each of the studs is a little light that can go on and off. And it's a binary messaging system. Instead of being 8 bits for a character, it's 6 bits, right? So each combination of those lights being on and off can be a code for a letter or a number or something else.
Is it binary though?
It is binary, yeah, because each...
I mean, there's on and off, but like when you get... It's Braille, really.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, it's Braille is also binary.
Is it?
At its base, yeah.
Okay.
Because it's made up of little bits that are on or off. But, I mean, you can say that about a lot of things, and it's not necessarily helpful.
It's blowing my mind that it's supposed to be individual towers, because not once during the gameplay did I think of it like that. I was like, I am looking at a 4x4 grid, and I have to move my token after I've done the letter, and I'm going to move it to a section that's another like tiny grid that is relevant to my gameplay. So I did not immerse in like the story of it, which I do not think affected my enjoyment of it, but it didn't occur to me to think of it that way.
That is a layer of abstraction that I think does separate it from the fiction of the book, because in the story of the game, you're kind of remotely operating these Clacks towers. So in the books, Clacks operators sit in the tower and they operate levers and buttons to turn the shutters on and off and do it as quickly as possible, and they log what the messages are as they go through, and then they turn around. Or I think there's meant to be 4 operators in one tower at a time, and one of them's like sort of interpreting the incoming messages, one of them's sending messages in one direction, and then on the other side of the tower there's someone who's sending messages and someone who's interpreting incoming messages in that direction so that they can go in both directions at once. And they're doing it in the tower.
So we'd probably be a good Clacks team, the 4 of us.
Yeah, we could have been one team. But this one kind of abstracts it so that you're remotely operating like a number of different towers, and there's these little buttons on the 4x4 grid, and you put your little piece on one of them, and that sort of says, I'm remotely operating these lights, which represent one specific tower. But I think the other thing that's weird is they overlap. So the middle part, that's the tower in the middle, overlaps with the one on the left and the one on the right, and that's a bit weird because it means they can't really...
I thought we were all in
towers.
The same tower, all sort of fighting for control of the Clacks in order to send our letter on.
See, that makes more sense. That could be more exciting, there'd be a bit of fisticuffs.
Yeah, that was what I imagined we were doing.
Yeah, I didn't even imagine it. I was just like, yep, no, here's a 4x4 grid and I am playing a game.
Yeah.
What if each of us was in our own tower and we had to pass a message on to the next person to try and get them, to try and get a word from one end to the other?
Yeah.
But then we're also trying to sort of sabotage each other as well, so that at the end of it, we've got to get the message through to win, but then only one of us can get the job. So we're also sort of sabotaging each other too.
Yeah, there's a version of the game that could be like a Whispers type game where by the end of it, you work out how bad you wrote the message, and it's quite funny. It's a reveal at the end that, it's a funny sentence.
Yeah, great.
Another alternative version could be 2 players versus 2 players, and it's kind of like a Semaphore version of Pictionary, where you have to try to communicate to other people a message, and your partner has to work it out and communicate back. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea of you're trying to... Yeah, it didn't feel like communication. It felt like solving a puzzle. And Clacks is all about communication. So that, it would have been really cool to have some element of there's a message that you're trying to get across and you don't know what that message is until the end of the game when you open the envelope or whatever it is and figure out what the answer is. Yeah.
Or if there's like a house player or something that like moves through some other metric and they are conveying a message and you have to try and understand what that message is as well on top of your goal. Just something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think where we're coming at here is we're saying, like, thematically, maybe it doesn't quite match up with the themes of what the CLACKS is about in the books. I mean, I think there is that logic puzzle kind of aspect of it does kind of fit, because the CLACKS is clearly like, it's an analog in the Discworld novels for the internet and for hacking and computers, and particularly computer networking. And so there is that kind of binary aspect to it. There's that coding aspect to it. And that kind of fits the logic puzzle part of the game. But then, yeah, you're right. It doesn't really feel like the thing you're doing is sending any information, because really you're just trying to match a pattern. And then what messes it up for you between one turn and the next, like you were saying, Lawrence, that it was very difficult to strategize, because...
Which I love. Yeah.
You love that it was difficult to strategize, Liz.
Yeah, because then you can just be like, oh, well, I'm drinking a cup of tea, like when these three goes, I'm going to help out this. I'm not having to plan several moves ahead, because that's a chumps game, because everyone's like moved their things around by then. You don't know what the board's going to look like. You can't predict that. So
it kind of sounds like you're saying you got to maximize the amount of time you didn't play the game.
Yeah.
I really like this game because I didn't have to play very much of it.
No, because it wasn't too difficult. It wasn't too taxing.
Right.
And I was able to enjoy being present with people whose company I enjoyed, without being like, but don't talk to me, I've got to think 3 moves ahead, because that's kind of how I approach games that are more strategic, and so it's not as social.
Yeah.
I turn into a game monster, which is no fun.
Did you guys think it was a fun game? I mean, I enjoyed playing it with you, but I didn't think of it as something, when I think of Discworld, I think of fun and funny and silly and taking serious topics, sort of topics that you wouldn't normally find humor in, and finding humor and ridiculousness in them. And with this, it felt like it sucked a lot of the silliness and the fun out of CLACKS, by turning it into a series of puzzles.
Yeah, I have to say, when I first arrived at Ben's place with the prospect of playing a Going Postal, related game, I thought we were going to be in a postal office. I thought it was going to be a game set in Moist's actual place of work. I didn't know it was just going to be about the CLACKS, which I had forgotten about. I needed to have it explained to me again. I wanted to see some golems.
No.
Yeah.
Though you did deploy it quite well. Like, did you have a moment of frustration in the game, and then you called someone else a clacker?
That did happen.
There we go. That's the type of gameplay we need.
We make our own fun.
Yeah. We made our own fun. But is it a game you can play with a bunch of strangers? Say you go to the CLACKS World Championships, of if there was a board game championships for this, maybe there is. I mean, there's a collector's edition, so I don't know. It could be very popular. Is it a game that you would play against people for fun, or would it be? It's not a social game as such. To me, it felt very introspective. Once it got to my turn, I was like drilling down into code and being very introspective.
It felt more like a game like old men play in the park, and you kind of walk up and like sort of meet the next Bobby Fischer of CLACKS.
Yeah, maybe, but I feel like it's not as directly competitive as that. Like, I think because you've got a little problem to solve, and that's the only way you get towards winning. If you're spending too much, I think if you're spending time and attention on what the other players are doing so that you can mess them up, that's not going to advance you very much. I mean, I can see that, there would be certain scenarios where it's like, well, I could go here and try and make this, or I could go here and try and send this letter. And if I go to that second option, that's going to mess Liz up more. So I'll do that one. But that requires you to be very aware of what Liz has got to do in a way that's quite difficult, I think.
Especially when Liz doesn't know what she's going to do.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a school of thought that this kind of game is actually very social, because it gives you the reason to be there sitting with other people, which is like one of the functions of tabletop games. Like, it's an excuse to get together. But also because, you're absorbed in your puzzle on your turn, but there's not much you can do when other people are taking their turn. There's a lot of conversation going on during people's turns because it's like, well, it doesn't matter what it doesn't matter what you do. I just have to deal with it when it comes back around to my turn. I don't need to pay attention right now.
But we use that well sometimes. I think Nick particularly, the first time we were all having a chat about something else, he quickly did his letter. He's like, I'm done, no one can sabotage me, goodbye.
That's true.
I think I even asked Ben a question that I knew he would have a lot of opinions on. It was
I'm going to go to the tape on that one. I'm going to find out what that question was. While Nick did ask me a question about problems in collaborative game design, and I did give a long answer, it wasn't on the turn where he took advantage of me monologuing. It turns out I'll do that all on my own. Here's the relevant bit of tape.
Oh, Lawrence has nearly won.
Yeah.
And it's all Liz.
Great work, Lawrence.
Great work, Liz.
Really good. And we, it was just a little joke between friends.
Alright, so I've got this card.
He can't sabotage you, don't worry.
You can play it if you want. You can play it any time you want. Yeah. On whoever you want.
Please don't.
Anytime, though. Oh.
Two in the morning comes into that.
I think where
Pebbles on your window.
I find though, like, this is just speaking from my experience playing with other players, is that I have no problem with someone like attacking me if I'm like ahead and I'm going to win.
No, it's the spirit of the game.
And that's the spirit of the game.
Yeah.
But then when it gets petty, if you insisted on attacking me when I'm clearly behind you,
this feels a bit self-serving. I don't know.
I mean, if I transmit a letter this turn, fair game.
Yeah.
But
my turn is over. No one managed to play a card.
Whoa! That's that. I think that's what they call it.
I'm going to write that in my notes for the episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Do a quick go. Ben's monologue.
Go. All right. No, fair call.
Another part of the game is where we all start off, I think, with one card that has some sort of action on it, and it could be something that helps you, or it could be something that sabotages someone else, and we don't know what everyone else has. So when someone has a go, it could be that they've just played their letter and it's working out well, then someone else can play a card that will intercept and ruin that. So if you can stop people from knowing in that moment is great.
Yeah.
So the rules are pretty vague on where and when you can play that card, which we had a bit of discussion about as well.
Yeah, there were. It's not. Board game rules are such an art, and so many companies do them quite badly. It's such a difficult job because not everybody understands the rules to a game in the same way, but you can only really print one manual for a game. And the BackSpindle team who made this game and also one of the other Discworld games, Guards, they take very much an approach that they like to lay out all the basic rules of the game first. Like, here are the basic concepts. And then they have different scenarios for different ways you can play the game, and they lay out how that specific one works. So the rules are kind of in several parts. I think that kind of works for this because the first part is basically, here's what a CLACKS tower is, just so you get the fictional thing. And here's the alphabet and how that translates into a system of lights. And here's how you arrange those lights on the board to make a letter. And now here's the rules for how you play a game with that information. But then there's some things that are vague. Like, you get these false report cards in the competitive version of the game, which allow you to either help yourself or hinder another player, because they do things like, I played one on you, Liz, that turned all the lights on the whole board off. And then, I could only use that card once, then it was gone. But that's pretty significant impact on the board.
Actually, that helped in the end. Ultimately, it made it easier to do things. You're like, oh wait, everything's off, so it's like a clean slate. I don't have to think through if I played, because you basically have cards that flip certain shapes of lights over, and that can break your brain when you're like, I'm playing two at once, but I need these ones on and that one's off. But if I play these overlapping ones, and you just sort of sit there being like, I need a notepad and notepaper, and everyone around you is like, do we put the timer on? How polite do we be about the fact that it's taking half an hour for her to figure out whether that's on or off? So yeah, when all the lights are off, great, easy.
This is also another point of tension in the game, I think, in that it is a puzzle game, but it's a puzzle game where the way that you turn the lights on and off is you have these little, they call them jacards. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they're basically like little punch cards that have a little pattern of lights on them, and you have to play that to switch on or off. Like, it changes the state of the lights in that pattern somewhere on the board. And so you're not just deciding, I'm going to turn these lights on or off. You have to go, well, I've got this pattern of lights I can turn on or off. Where can I put that where it's going to get me closer to my goal? And that's a Tetris-y kind of, how do I move this around? How do I map this onto this one thing onto this other thing kind of puzzle? So it's quite thinky. And like you were saying, we can't plan for in advance, because if you're playing a full 4-player game, 3 other people have changed the state of the board between your last turn and this one, and the board's not that big, so it's almost certainly going to have affected what you thought you could do. And that means it's very thinky, so you're sort of sitting there thinking, so the turns take quite a while. And that also kind of leads to other people sitting there not just waiting for their turn to come around because 3 other people have got to have a go, but because each of those 3 other turns is going to take 5 minutes as someone thinks about what they're going to do.
So there was this great moment where, like, it's right near the end, and I was like, well, I can't make a letter, so I'm just going to flip some things to make it easier, and I did something, and Lawrence was like, oh no, and then I did more, and he's like, oh no, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Just completely ruined his turn without meaning to. Never plan ahead.
Yeah.
I found out why they're called Jacquards. Mm-hmm. So it's from the book, and the inventor of the punch card was Joseph Marie Jacquard. So it's like named after him. That's why they're called Jacquards rather than punch cards in Discworld. Yeah. Which is a very Terry Pratchett thing, just to take a fairly normal thing and go, no, this name is too normal. I'm going to have, it's going to be exactly the same thing as in the real world, but I'm going to give it a funny name. So it feels a bit more fantasy science fiction-y.
Clearly should have done more research there. But thank you, Nick, for doing that for me. Very, very pleased that you've solved that mystery. Just to be clear, Joseph Marie Jacquard isn't a Discworld character. He invented punch cards on Roundworld, where they stored the data for an early form of automation for looms, allowing fabric with complicated patterns to be produced much more easily. This was a device that attached to a loom, and the resulting loom was called a Jacquard loom or Jacquard machine. In Going Postal, Jacquards are only mentioned by name a few times, and the origin of the name is one of those little historical references Pratchett does not explain. In that book, though, towers are still primarily operated by hand. Jacquards are used as keys for operators, as a combination of password and safety mechanism. Certainly, there's no remote operation via buttons, like there is in the board game, though John Deerhart was working on much more advanced CLACKS technology, so perhaps that came later. This is also probably a good time to mention that while the CLACKS is much more sophisticated, the version in the books at least is based on real round-world technology, the optical telegraph, which was popular particularly in France towards the end of the 18th century. You can find out more about that in the episode notes for Pratchett 38, our episode about Going Postal.
I mean, the question from before, I found the game enjoyable and I would play it again, but my thought is it isn't very Pratchett-y. Like, the most Pratchett-y things about it are like the name, like the words that you're trying to get across.
Mm. Does everyone remember what word they got, by the way?
Ooh.
Guild.
Guild. See, they are quite Discworld-y words, I think. My word was clots.
Yeah, I went through the deck and there's ones like Adora as well, because they're all 5 letters, and gnome and stuff like that. I can't remember mine, which shows how like fragmented. I wasn't into the story at all. I was like, okay, I'm doing 1 letter at a time to play on this 4x4 board.
Yeah, I don't remember mine. Mine had a T in it. That's all I remember.
I've got some photos. Let's see if I can find them. You know.
But just putting Discworld words in a board game doesn't make it a Discworld board game. Like,
that's very esoteric of you.
Well, no, but like, as a proud owner of like The Simpsons Monopoly, or, you know, like Friends Cluedo, like it doesn't really, you know, we all know what they're doing, and it doesn't, to me, it doesn't make it a more Discworldy game.
Mm.
Lawrence's word was Tomas, and my word is covered up in little red cubes.
Yes. Is that your way of boasting again, Liz, that you were winning?
Not directly. It's that you could. It starts with H, I think.
H. I'm just looking through the deck
it was
of
like
cards.
Ben, you said, is it someone's name, like a last name?
It could be. No, it's Herney. Herney the Hunted. Who's a sort of a minor god on the Discord. Yeah, here he is. Here it is. I found the card for it. So I will say, like, they've put a lot of effort into, because I feel like we've been quite negative about the game, but there are some great things about it. One of them is they put a lot of effort into the look of it, in that even the cards for what word you get, they look like a little telegram form. They have like the little logo of the Grand Trunk on them. It says CLACKS transmission request form. and then it's got the letters as if they've been typed into a form, and then under each letter it's got the pattern of the lights. Although I will say I found it very annoying that the patterns of lights on the actual cards that you get, I really struggled to remember that the white circles were lights on and the black coloured in ones were lights off. And it's much clearer on the sort of guide to the whole alphabet, which is like a big cardboard tile that you get to hand around to the players, because it has a much darker frame. It's easier to tell that the white circles are lights on and the black circles are lights off. So I found that was a little bit weird. But otherwise it looks fun. And like the other cards also look like forms that you might find, post office, I guess.
Yeah. And because we didn't get to play the cooperative version. And in the cooperative version, you've got little spaces around the outside of the board for the different towers. And you have the little, your message is moving from tower to tower to tower, while at the same time the Moist is on his horse, also sort of, riding around. And that, maybe that would have been, I felt a little bit more like we were in the book.
Yeah.
And I played that because you can play that solo, and it is quite tense. I lost. Moist beat me there, and I think I got the last letter, because in that you have to send 2 words, not just the one. And in between the 2 words, you also have to send the character for a space. And then at the end of the 2 words, you have to send the character for end message. And what did I get? I got a really good combo. I got Death's Gone. That was my 2 words that I drew randomly. That was great. And it is quite tense because in the competitive game, it's like an action point system. So if you've played a board game like Pandemic or something like that, it has a similar system where on your turn, you have a certain number of points you can spend to do actions. And you basically spend those to move to another CLACKS tower. Which conceptually, like the way that the game is explained, you're pressing a button to select another remote CLACKS tower, but you have to spend points and move a little meeple around the board, which makes it feel like you're walking to another tower, which I thought was slightly weird. But anyway, you can't send a letter from the same tower twice, which again doesn't quite make thematic sense, but it's a board game. Sometimes you have to let a few things like that go through for the sake of the gameplay. And so you spend points on that, and then you can spend points on playing your jacquards, which have little symbols on them, and some of them, which are probably less helpful, cost less points. And then the ones that are more precise, like they switch off more complicated patterns or smaller patterns of lights, they cost more points to use, and you can't spend more than 5 of those points on a turn. Now, in the cooperative game, you only have 2 cards or jacquards in your hand that you can use on your turn. You can use both of them, but for every point on one of those that you spend, and they usually got between 1 and 3, that's how many spaces Moist goes forward on his horse.
Oh.
And he's got more spaces than you. So you've got, I think it's 12 CLACKS towers between you and the destination. And he's got either 34 or 38 spaces to go, depending on whether you play the easy or the hard mode of the cooperative game.
Can you send him backwards or distract his horse or anything at any point? Yeah,
so the way that works is you don't use the same action cards that you use in the competitive game. So you don't use the fault report cards. Instead, you have 2 other sets of cards, one of which is definitely bad for you. And what you do is you draw 2 of those and you put them face down without knowing what they are. And you put 2 quite desirable specific jacquards on top of them that are very useful. And if you want to use one of those, you can discard one of yours and use that instead, but then you have to pick up the card that's under it, and it's going to have some sort of setback for you. And then there's 2 other cards from the other deck, which are more ambiguous. Sometimes they're good for you, sometimes they're bad. And you put 2 jacquards face down on top of those, so you don't know what you're going to get. But you're like, well, the ones I've got aren't going to help me, so I'm going to take one of those ones I don't know what it is. Maybe it'll be helpful, and maybe the card underneath will be helpful or not as well. And there's only those 4 cards that you can kind of use at some point during the game to try and help you. Now, I did draw one when I was playing it. There was one which was like a newspaper interview, like a journalist shows up and wants to ask me questions about the CLACKS, so I'm distracted and Moist gets ahead. And then there was another one where I can't remember what the fictional reason was for it, but Moist didn't move at all that turn. So they can go a bit both ways. But that was like the solo version of it. We talked a bit about cooperative games when we were playing this, and they do have, as I know you've experienced, Nick, because I introduced you and a couple other friends to Pandemic, and you did not have a good time because one of our other friends just sort of Was that you? Maybe it was somebody else.
Yeah, no, it was me. Yeah.
Yeah, it was you. And because one of our other friends just sort of took over the game and told everyone what to do, which is a danger. The term for it in board game circles is quarterbacking, which is that somebody else basically just takes over and tells everyone else what to do in the game. And I think some games, we talked about this on the day when we were playing this, some games do a better job of dealing with that, but there's only so much you can do in the rules of the game. And I think this would have that problem. But I think maybe because it's an absorbing puzzle, you know, we were, as we've said a couple of times, we were just helping each other out even when we were playing competitively. If we were playing collaboratively where the goal was for us all to win together, maybe that would have been better. But it was quite tense. I enjoyed the solo version of it.
Yeah.
I'm stressed just hearing about it.
I do like the idea of, like, if we are competing, that we've got this goal of we've got a goal of sending a message, but if we're also competing at the same time, then maybe, there's sort of a room in there for a little bit of sabotage as well. So, you know, to avoid the quarterbacking type thing, because people have got their own little goals that they're trying to achieve as well, just to make it a little bit more fun.
Kind of semi-cooperative game, like The Witches.
Yeah. What if the game was a little bit more like something like Love Letters? You know, like where the game Love Letters. It's like that's a card game, but you're basically trying to deliver messages in the form of cards to a lady to win her favor. But there's something like that where you are trying to sort of, you know, gather together information and move it from one place to another. Because then you can be a little bit more duplicitous.
Oh, there's also I know this comes up every time, but in Castles of Mad King Ludwig, you have your individual goals as well, which is to have like the most L-shaped rooms, or you get extra points if you have big round rooms or whatever. So if there could be one tied to if you manage to get people to play a certain number of this many cards, like L-shaped cards or something like that, that can be your secret goals. So that could also be like, oh, you should play that, and you should also do this, and then that's actually contributing to your own thing secretly at the end as well, so that could also address it. Yeah,
and I guess having someone trying to come in and hack the system, a saboteur is not necessarily for this book, but for the clacks in general. That's on theme, right?
Well, there are hackers in Going Postal.
Are they? There are too. That's right. Yeah,
the smoking GNU.
Yes, smoking GNU.
Or GNU. Yeah. So that will be on theme. And some of the cards that affect you, the action cards, they do have stuff like that in them. I feel like we're sort of reaching a consensus where we like a lot of the things about the game, but we found the actual experience of playing it competitively maybe a bit disappointing.
I enjoyed every moment of that game. Every single moment.
I think it does get tense at the end because we were all equally matched, apart from Ben. Our finding the last letter was our chance to seize the prize, and Liz came through with the goods in the end. But it did get tense at the end, but it was, I think before then, it was just quite a lonely game experience. A lonely puzzle.
Yeah.
And some games are like that. Like I think I mentioned Wingspan, which is a very popular game about attracting birds to a habitat to get points. You don't really interact with the other players very much, but you don't really care because you're just looking at these beautiful bird cards in front of you, reading bird facts and getting bird powers. You're not really worried about it.
Bird powers?
Yeah, the birds have powers. But the powers are things like laying eggs and eating other birds. Like they're quite on theme for actual birds.
Right, it's just like bird traits, really.
Yeah, that's fair.
Are the other Discworld games more funny or fun or have that kind of sense of humor about them?
The Witches one, I think, is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Witches one is very thematically on point for the Tiffany Aching younger witch books, and it's semi-cooperative, so, you are competing to be the best witch in training, but you're also trying to help each other out. Yeah, and solve the problem of death. That's right. And the other one that these designers worked on is very I think I had sort of thoughts about whether or not I would like it before we played it, but it's called Guards, and it's not really based on Guards. It's got watch characters in it, but it's not really based on the plot of that book, apart from the fact that it does have dragons in it and you can summon them. But it's sort of this madcap chase around Ankh-Morpork, and it's very silly, and you're running around the city and getting magic items, and getting trodden on by the luggage when it roams around the board. And it's a very stupid, silly experience. And it was a lot of fun, but it is that sort of chaotic, kind of very random game. And I mean, we were talking about, there being luck in this game, but there's very little randomness. There is the randomness of the Jacquards, but you are solving a logic puzzle where, you can see, you have complete information. Like, what the state of the board is, what state you need the board to be in. The only thing you don't know is what's going to happen between your turn and other people's turns. But when it comes back to you and you're solving that puzzle, you're like, okay, well, I've got these pieces and this puzzle. How do I put them together? Whereas in Guards, like, just random weird stuff happens when you roll the dice.
Well, I know it's really that thing where, like, I've played a very few board games, so it's like this really reminds me of that other thing that I've only done like 5 of. Like, Parasite reminds me of Squid Game because they're both Korean and they're both about class. Like, it doesn't like that, but like, this really reminded me of Mahjong more than anything else. Perhaps because it was like 4 players sitting around a square, but there's also like things you can do to sabotage each other, and sometimes there's only something the person to one side of you can do, and sometimes there's things that everyone can do, and there's the unpredictability of how other 3 players are going to affect what's out there. But again, that's probably a very basic game thing that I'm only picking up on because I only have a handful of games to draw upon. So, but while we were sitting there, I was like, it kind of is like that thing where when someone throws out a tile, you can pick it up if you're sitting to one side of them, but the person opposite cannot because of the kind of thing. Yeah, I just found that a comparator that. And now you all owe me money, so.
Because you beat us at Discord Mahjong.
Yeah.
Is this an obscure Terry Pratchett game, or is this one of the favourites that the Terry Pratchett games community play?
Look, there are only 5 published Discord board games.
Okay.
And this was the last one, the most recent one to be published. So it came out about 7 months after he died, and he would clearly have had influence. Because Leonard and David, who designed this game, like, they approached him to design their first one, which was Guards, and he liked it, but said, go away and learn the craft a bit more and then come back and do it when you're ready. And then this was their second one that was Discworld related. They've published other games as well. And they're all fairly well known. This is the only one that was easily available in the recent past because most of them are out of print. The license expired with whoever had created them. So the only ones that were still available up until fairly recently were this and Thud, it's a game based on a game played in the Discworld, but the game kind of came before the book that most heavily features it because the person who designed it came up with it, and then Terry went, that's actually really good. That's given me an idea for a book. Those were the ones that were around. The one I think that's the most popular is the one that we haven't played for the podcast yet, which is Ankh-Morpork. It has a big map of Ankh-Morpork, and you're all lords with a secret role, like a secret identity, who have a different win condition. It's actually quite similar to what you were saying earlier. You have a goal that nobody else knows what your goal is, that you're trying to achieve by taking control of different parts of the city. That's probably the most popular one, but it's also very out of print now. You have to buy it secondhand, and those copies go for quite a lot of money because people who are Discworld fans really want it.
So my question is there a chance that the game developers will listen to this podcast? Because if it's niche upon niche...
No, there is definitely a chance. I'm pretty sure they listened to our episode about their other game. So, Leonard and David, if you're listening, I'm sorry, this feels like we've been quite critical.
I said I enjoyed every minute. I've consistently said that through the whole thing.
I think we should have played... Like, my plan was, I thought that the competitive game would go quite quickly, and then we could try playing the cooperative game, and I felt like we probably would enjoy the cooperative game more, but the competitive one was slightly simpler in some ways, and I thought we'd learn it quickly, we'd play it quickly, we'd play it. But then because the puzzle is quite thinky, and you have to do a lot of translation of, like, particularly when you're playing it for the first time, as all of us were, the turns took so long that we didn't get to play it twice. So I think that's partly on me. I didn't think about that aspect of the game. I wish that we had played the cooperative one because I really enjoyed the solo version of the cooperative game, and I think it would be good.
I'd be up for doing it for fun.
How well it would translate to playing with multiple players, I don't know. There is a mode where they say you can't communicate what Jacquards you have to each other. It's like you're in separate clacks towers and you can't really talk to each other except by what messages you send through the clacks. I think that would sort of complicate things and make it feel a bit more like you were sending a message, like you were saying earlier, Nick. But whether or not that would be a fun experience, I don't know. I really want to try it out.
Because it's almost a chance to give feedback to the creators if they were going to put out a clacks too. we have some good feedback.
Yeah, I think sadly there's not much chance of that because there's now a much bigger UK board game publisher, Modifius, does a lot of role-playing games, but also other kinds of tabletop games. They now have a license to make tabletop Discworld games, and their first one is a role-playing game, which they've just crowdfunded for about £2 million. But they do have a more general kind of tabletop games license. So I think any future board games will be new ones from them rather than revised versions of existing ones.
Do you have to play as a role, or can you be other types of bread?
It's a devastating thing for you to say to me, of all people. How could you do this? No.
I have the Board Game Geek rankings for all of the games, like the reviews and so on. Ankh-Morpork is 7.25. It's the most popular one. CLACKS is second, and then The Witches, and then Thud, and then Guards is the least popular.
Okay.
Huh.
So this is the second most popular. What do we know? What do I know?
But it's still got a 6.24 out of 10.
Okay.
Loved every minute.
Well, look, I will say take the Board Game Geek scores with a pinch of salt because they are mostly voted on by a very particular kind of board game nerd.
Yes.
I'm one of them. I think also it's important to remember that unlike a lot of those sort of public voting sites, they do have a little guide as to what each score is meant to mean. And I think 7 means good game. I will usually play if it's suggested to me. That's a pretty good opinion of a game, right? And yet, I think most people voting treat it much like, video game scores where anything that's 7 or lower is like, well, this game's no good at all, right? It's got to get like 9 or I don't care. But then it's very hard to get a score that high on Board Game Geek. So, I don't know, take those with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Looking at the comments, they tend to agree with us that the theming is beautiful and there's some really clever moments if you play the right version in the right way, but it can get frustrating.
Yeah. I will say that I think the basic mechanics of this would lend itself to homemade variants pretty easily. A lot of the ideas that you've suggested, I think we could make a variant of the game that incorporate a lot of that using a lot of the same basic rules. So maybe that's worthwhile. We'll try and make a Pratchett variant. But also I think the collector's edition does have some more game modes, like some more alternate ways to play than the original does. So it might also be worth investigating those and finding out.
I can't wait to see Liz and Ben, you guys create your own Pratchett game based on your podcast. That's what I want to see.
Yep.
And play.
Me too. Yep.
Would it be cooperative or competitive?
Very competitive.
So Ben will have the Ben character will have a journey where he's trying to do a rational, sensible goal, and the other players are just throwing him off course with puns and just annoying comments and just tangents and things. So it's basically maybe there's a line from the start to the finish that you're trying to get through, but there's a winding path that things can knock you onto at any given time.
I mean, that's just podcast, the board game. That's not unique to us.
Yes.
But that's all right.
I think I was talking about, I'm sure I mentioned something like a fake artist in New York where you have a group of people sitting around doing an episode of Pratchett, but one of the people hasn't read the book and you have to try and figure out which person at the table hasn't read the book.
That's totally me.
Yeah.
I absolutely enjoy that.
You read the book.
I read the book. I just can't remember it.
Well, imagine we were playing and it wasn't you who hadn't read the book, but you couldn't remember it. That would really throw the other players right off. You'd be like, yeah, and the bit with the snakes was great. And we'd be like, what are you talking about?
But then there'd secretly be a bit of the snakes that we'd all missed, a subtle one. And then just
throw everyone into disarray. Are there any moments from the game or any particular things that stood out to you that you either really loved or maybe just haven't mentioned yet, even if you didn't love them?
I'm just having a look at my notes. I think I've covered it, because here's what my notes are. There's 4 lines. Mirror bad, black and white, when to play card, and clacker. And I've already mentioned clacker, so...
Yeah.
Oh, mirroring. We didn't even talk about that. So
yeah.
One of the things you can do is the cards have these little shapes, and they're a bit like Tetris shapes if you're familiar with those. But one of the things you're allowed to do is not just rotate them to orient them on the board wherever you want. You can also mirror them as if you're flipping them upside down. In a digital game, I don't have a problem with that. But in a physical game, if you turn the tile over, they're only printed on, like, they have a symbol on the other side, right? Because you're meant to be able to put some of them face down in certain versions of the game and not know what they are. So you can't turn it upside down and see what the shape looks like mirrored. You have to do that in your brain. And that just adds to the sort of cognitive load of figuring out how to make the whole thing work.
Part 3 of the UMAT.
What if they had a card, and when you get the card, if you play that card, you can mirror the pattern. So, but you've got it, and the card has the mirrored pattern on it. So, it makes mirroring something you can do, but only on if you've got the right card.
And that could work because, like, there's only like one shape really. Well, maybe two, but there's only a couple of shapes where it really makes a difference that you can mirror them anyway.
Yeah, like the L and the L and the T. Yeah.
Or perhaps they should make them like jacquards, so they actually have punch holes in them.
Yeah.
The actual real punch cards, so then you can invert it and turn it any direction and see through the holes.
Yeah. That would be cool.
It'd be cool. I mean, because you do pull them out of a bag most of the time in the game, so you would still get a random one. It's just you wouldn't be able to stack them, face down because you could see what they were from the holes. But I do like that because that'd be fun. It'd be much more expensive to make though.
I feel like magicians would be able to like feel that and then be like, and now I've randomly selected like 3 cards.
Yeah, that's true.
If you were playing with someone who knew Braille, they'd have a massive advantage as well, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. They should make a Braille version of the game.
It's good.
Look, we did get a few great listener questions. Let's get on to those, Liz.
All right, so the first one comes from Sven via Discord. How easy did you find the instructions, and how important are easy instructions for a game for you? I have the game, but found the manual so hard that we haven't played the game. Can I just start by saying that I felt very lucky that Ben read the instructions and just explained it to us, and I didn't have to deal with that at all, which I appreciate, and thank you, Ben.
That's all right.
Yeah, because even though, Ben, you had read the instructions and, you were across the game, but you were constantly picking it up and trying to not just figure out whether something was allowed, but figuring out which part of the instructions do I read to find out whether this is allowed.
Yeah.
So I guess I would say they are... I could understand them, but on the other hand, I've been playing a lot of board games for a very long time. And I think that certain elements of how they're laid out are actually pretty great. But there are some things, even just little things, like they use some non-standard terms. Like when they're talking about how you get those fault report cards in the competitive game, they don't say draw a card. They say if you get, because the way you get them is some of the little jacquards have a little symbol on them, and if you draw one of those, you get to take one of the fault report cards and then you can play it later. But what it says in the manual is if a player draws a jacquard marked with a fault stamp from the bag, they must lift the top fault report card from the deck. Now, lift it from the deck is not standard board game language, right? Are you drawing it to keep it and play it later? Are you drawing it and now you have to do what it says? Like, that is an important thing to make clear. And you kind of have to read through all of the instructions for the card and put it together. So I think there's little things like that where it's not as clear as it could be.
I was holding the card above the deck for the whole afternoon. I just lifted it. I followed the instructions to a T. My arms were sore. I'm still holding it now.
It's still. I knew there was one missing. I mean, it's a good thing that you've developed your sleight of hand skills, Lawrence. So you had the finger strength to do it.
However, if people didn't know that terminology, Ben, and you drew the card, someone might grab a pencil and a paper and illustrate the card. So
I feel. Are we for real? Like, has everyone played a card game? Is that still... See, this is a good question, actually. Do we think people still learn to play regular, like, standard poker deck kind of card games, and then they learn those sort of basics of card game terminology? Or is that now a lost art now that everybody grows up and they're just playing games on their iPads and stuff?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, I'm a magician, I don't know whether... I don't know what...
Neither of you can answer that question.
What about your children?
Well, with the children of magicians, they know how to do a false deal at the age of 2.
Yeah. But
all right, so we don't have the right sample, so maybe that's a question we throw over to the listeners.
Yes.
Yeah, but how important to you, though, is a manual being easy to read? Is that a big thing for you?
Yes, 100%.
Yes, has to be written in plain English. And as you were describing earlier, how the manual is structured is really important. And I think the overview should be really clear because that's going to make me decide whether I want to really play the game or not. So just a really quick overview has to be very clear on what the game is.
Yeah.
I think I'd like it if manuals had a QR code in them that when you scan it, it shows someone setting up the game.
Oh, some of them absolutely do.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
The
apps
oatmeal
for that.
games, all of those games, like Exploding Kittens, they actually say, like, stop, do not read the instructions. It is a terrible way to learn how to play a board game. Go watch the video.
I mean, look, I'll just stick my oar in here and say it's a terrible way to learn how to play a board game if the way you do it is the first time you open the rules is when you've sat down to play the game. If anyone takes anything away from this podcast about playing board games, my number one thing, and I'm not the first person to say this, but if you are going to play a new game with other people and you own the game, it's your job to open the game, read through the rules, figure out how it works, and then when people sit down to play with you, have an idea of it. Don't be reading that rule book for the first time when you sit down at the table the first time. That's a bad plan. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth.
All right, so our next questions come from Molokov via Discord. The first one is competitive or cooperative mode, which is better? So I feel like we've covered that a little bit because Ben is the only one who's experienced both. But what's your consensus with yourself?
I would still want to try the competitive mode because the solo mode's not quite the same. Like the basic gameplay is the same. And I think actually, and look, I want to really give props to this because I think we played the worst version of the game.
Great, because I loved it.
I think the actual race version of the game is kind of cool. And I think they've done a really good job of tuning it because the first time I played it, I nearly won, but I didn't. And that's really what you want from a solo or cooperative experience. You want a game that you feel like you can win, but it's not easy. And I think if I played it a couple more times, I probably could win, but I don't know that I'd win every time. And I would want to try it a few more times because I'm not sure how easy it is to win. I don't know if, it always comes down to the wire and maybe it's slightly too hard or it's just right. Like it's hard to know until you play it a few times, but it felt really tense and exciting until kind of a bit like the competitive game, actually, until the last couple of turns where it seemed pretty clear I wasn't going to get there, but I'm going to play them anyway and just see because you never know what might happen. But I think the cooperative game could be the best version. But I did like the solo version probably better than the competitive one.
All right, and the second question is, I really like the pattern matching aspect of this game, so trying to find the letters in the shadow patterns or to flip the shadows based on the cards you have. However, some aspects, such as the hazard cards, I think overcomplicate the game. If you can make one small tweak to streamline the game, what would it be? So Molokov's would be to eliminate or at least simplify the random event hazard cards.
What do you reckon? What if you could just change one thing about how it's played, what would you do?
I don't know what I would change, but I think if you eliminate the hazard cards, or you really are sort of eliminating any sense of strategy from the game at all. Without those cards there, it is really just try and solve the puzzle when it's your turn until the game's finished. Perhaps more interesting hazard cards than just, I'm going to stop you or I'm going to undo what you just did. Things that maybe... They can be like a life gives you lemons, but you turn into lemonade type hazard cards.
Yeah, I feel the same way. The hazard cards are useful because it keeps the game a little bit more entertaining because it adds a certain sense of hindering or benefiting yourselves, but also more jokes. It needs more jokes in this game. So the hazard cards are the jokes, or could be the jokes.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
Not to join in the we all love the hazard cards chorus, but I think, because the question is how to streamline the game, I do think actually if we increase the number of hazard cards and the opportunities to have them, you start out with 2 rather than 1, and that it's not entirely dependent on jack cards to get more of them, and that there's more variety of what they do, that would be great because it would make the game a bit more strategic, as we've talked about. But I also think if we got rid of mirroring, it would make it harder to process letters individually on your turn. So it kind of almost went you go around and you get a letter, next person gets a letter, next person gets a letter, and the game just sort of has the same sort of tension going round and round and round. I think if it was a little bit more difficult to send the letter off, then the game would be more interesting. And I think it would be more streamlined in a way, because you're not just sort of doing the same thing each turn. So there's different strategy to try and get back ahead, that kind of thing, which is why I think we should increase the number of hazard cards and make it more difficult to send a letter.
Being a game designer, I find it very difficult to think of just one change. And I've just thought, and this is drawing on things particularly that you said, Nick, there is a version of this where maybe instead of having to move around the board, which I still find a little bit weird in the fiction of how the CLACKS towers work, but if each player had a fixed position on the board, and when they sent a letter, they passed that letter on to the next player, and then that's the letter that the next player has to send. And there would be some other way to mark, sort of your points, but that's sort of the puzzle you're solving is passing this letter along, so it goes down the chain of towers and gets to the end. And if you're drawing, maybe you'd be drawing the letters one at a time. Maybe part of the game is, you have those secret objectives, like you were saying, Nick, where you're trying to, corrupt the word or you slip a dirty word into the message somewhere or something, that kind of thing where the letter you send is not necessarily the letter you're given, but you're trying to subvert the message somehow. I feel like there's something like that would then feel a bit more like the experience of the CLACKS towers from the book. And I think if I could change something, that would be it. But that's not quite what Molokov's asking. I think if I was going to change just one thing to streamline it, I would find a way to get rid of the having to move between towers thing. I think if each player had a fixed position on the board, it's just one less thing to think about. It would make the turns a bit quicker. And I think in a multiplayer game where other players' turns mess up the board for you, you want the turns to be nice and quick. It's one of the things that works so well about Ticket to Ride is that, someone will make a play where they take the bit of the train tracks that you really wanted, but their turn is really quick because they just do one thing on their turn and your turn comes around again so fast that you don't really mind. And I think this game could use a bit more of that energy. And maybe that would come if you played it a lot and you got much better at solving the puzzle. You wouldn't take so long to think about it. But
so maybe with like a 3x3 grid, and then you've got up to 4 players and everyone's got their own sort of 6,
That would be chaos because you'd be interfering a lot with each other, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but not interfering. You would be able to sort of predict, okay, this is the person who's going to mess with me and they've got this way of messing, this specific thing, and I know that they want to try and change this to that based on what they've done previously. So you can kind of try and plan ahead in that sense.
And you can see everyone's word and letters, so you can actually see what they're aiming to do.
Yeah, and see whether you can use that against them in some way.
Yeah, okay. I like that.
The next one is a game that sounds really fun, but I don't know if we can play it remotely, unfortunately.
I'm going to give it No, I think we can. I'm going to give it a go.
So it's a word game from Molotov by Discord. Deal out 20 cards to all players and see who can make the longest proper sentence with only the 5-letter word on their cards. Newspaper headlines count, which is, I feel like, advantage to me working at a newspaper.
Now, when he says deal out 20 cards to all players, not sure exactly how that works.
I think it would just be like we take it in turns to have 20 cards.
I feel like we all have the same 20 cards, otherwise we're going to be here all night. But then you have to pick out 5 words and make the best sentence. Liz, can you type these into the chat? I'm going to draw the cards.
Now, remember, Ben, to lift up the card above the deck. Not draw it, lift them up.
Lift it up. I'm working out my finger muscles. So I've just dealt out 20 words. Liz has typed them in the chat so everyone can see them. Our job is to try and pick out words and make a sentence out of them.
Okay.
Out of that list of 20 words.
As many words as you can?
Yeah. Just not a lot of verbs. This is the problem. There's not a lot of verbs. I've just immediately gone, what's the dirtiest joke thing that I can say with these words?
Well, I mean, Sonky, he'll be a Sonky thing.
Well, it is a Sonky thing. Do you want to hear what it was? This is the first one I thought of.
Yeah.
Magic Sonky, Shine Thomas. I mean, they're all going to sound like telegrams, aren't they? Old school telegram. Nick, that snigger makes me think you've got one.
Almost. All right. Minus. It doesn't quite work, but it doesn't matter. Pixie Thief, Eureka Selwyn, trolled Guild Klotz, Adora Andre Ahmed Grote.
Okay.
That does feel like a newspaper headline.
Yeah.
Mine is in a very similar structure, actually. It is Magic Sonky Thief Monks Troll Shiny Guild.
Oh, that's pretty good.
That's someone who's written a headline.
Yeah. Oh, the arts. The same theme. Using troll for trolling.
I'm still working on mine. And
You're going to say, Eureka, I've got it, when you do?
I don't think I'm going to... I can't top yours. I'm not going to try. I'm going to stick with my slightly saucy one.
What? Monks shine magic sonky. It doesn't seem like something monks would do.
Oh, is the word monks there?
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that. Monks and gnome.
Yeah, mine is Magic Pixie Thief trolls the Sonky Guild.
Sonky Guild.
I think we've all come up with like variations on a theme there. But then, again, not many verbs. So full marks for everyone who decided to use troll as a verb. I think that's inspired. I did want to finish on a question of my own, which is, you know, I think we've kind of outlined that we found this as a puzzle game a little bit disappointing. Is there a game with maybe a similar kind of feel? Maybe it's a logic puzzle kind of game. Maybe it's another competitive game where you mess up your opponents. Maybe it's another game that involves words or communication and maybe a stronger theme than this one. But is there a game that you would recommend to someone who maybe can't get a hold of this because it's a little bit harder to get a hold of? There are still copies floating around, particularly of the collector's edition. Or if, you know, like you think that, like us, you might find it a bit disappointing, is there maybe a game that you might like more with a similar theme?
I've sifted through like the 5 board games that I have played in my life and I'm familiar with to answer Ben's question, and I'm going to come back to, honestly, Mahjong is probably the most comparable one that I can think of. I don't know if you've all played it, but there is a puzzle element to it because it is kind of like poker or those card games where you're trying to make a certain pattern within your hand, but it's quite a big hand. Like, I can't remember, it's been a while, it's like 12 or 13 tiles, but it depends on what you're dealt initially. You have to decide what ones you're going to go for. There's statistics in there as well, like you have to see what's been thrown out. You have to try and guess what other people are trying to collect because that can impact, because there's only 4 of each kind of tile out there. So, and you can also pick up things from other people based on where they are. So I think there is actually a comparable element to it. But I do caveat that with, I do not know many games.
That's fair enough.
Plus you get to yell pung, like if you're taking someone's tile, and that's fun.
That does seem fun. I've never played proper Mahjong. I've only played like secondhand, watered down computer game Mahjong.
Oh, it's very satisfying. Like, it's the physical feel of the tiles is part of it, and them all clacking against each other when you're like shuffling them and making the towers. It's, it's a tactile game, and I don't think online is remotely the same.
How about you, Nick or Lawrence? Are there any games you'd recommend?
Not so much a game, but rather an experience which is similar to this, which is putting together IKEA furniture, looking at the manual. And the instructions are also a code. It has obscure words, short words that I don't understand, often with many dots, almost like braille dots above letters. And it's frustrating.
Yep.
So much like CLACKS.
But at the end of it, you end up with a bookshelf.
So, you do end up with a bookshelf.
Even if you're trying to build a bed.
Yes, that's correct.
How about you, Nick?
Maybe it's a bit of a boring choice, but I think something like Codenames, like just classic trying to communicate across the table without communicating, and there's a little bit of skullduggery, and it's got the same kind of grid pattern. You've got the cards all laid out on the table, like the CLACKS grid. There could be something in, I don't know, that felt like maybe that'd be a better game to play. There's another one that reminds me, just in terms of the sort of laying out of patterns, which is Sagrada, I think is how it's pronounced, where you have to make a stained glass window using dice, and there's sort of various rules of logic about where each dice is allowed to be played, and you've basically got to fill this stained glass window with colored dice, and it's just a very pretty game, but it's got kind of similar ideas of pattern making and logic puzzles.
That's cool. I also thought of Codenames. I think that's a really good call for one that's on the still quite a difficult communication puzzle, but also some sort of logical stuff, but it's to do with language. So I think that's a really good pick. I think if you want to go more complicated and really lean into the logic puzzle side of things, there's a great game called Turing Machine, where you have to guess a sequence of numbers, but there's this kind of cardboard computer thing that lets you test your guesses and gives you clues back. And it's all kind of automated and everyone gets to play at the same time. So that's really leaning heavily into the logic side of things. And if you want to go somewhere in between Turing Machine and Codenames, probably Decrypto is a really good pick. That's where you have to send a code to your own teammates, but without letting the opposite team know. Kind of like Wikisneaks that I was talking about before, but in board game form. Look, that kind of brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you very much, Nick and Lawrence, for coming and playing this game with us and discussing it. I'm sorry that we had maybe a bit of a disappointing experience with it, but maybe we can get back together. Yes, no, well, you won, Liz. We've covered
It's
this.
not so I won. It was fun.
Well, we'll play it again, but we'll try the cooperative version and see if we like that better. I would really like to try that out properly because I do think it would be good.
For all my whinging, I had a blast. Like I don't think I've been in the same room with the four of you in a very long time. And it was really just a pleasant way to spend an afternoon. Like, I think spending an afternoon playing a slightly disappointing board game and talking about Terry Pratchett is a pretty great way to spend a day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we'll do it again. We'll do it again.
Great to hang out.
And look, if people want to find out more about what you've been up to or what you're doing next, how can they find out? Nick, do you want to tell us first?
Sure. I'm Honest Con Man on most social media, and you can find out about what I'm doing, which at the moment is mostly sleep related. But I'm going to be doing a family magic show at the Comedy Festival next year. So I've just got my venue locked in, and I'm very excited about that.
That's exciting. And Lawrence, where can people find out about you and what are you up to at the moment?
Yeah, I am Mr. Lawrence Leung on Instagram, or lawrenceleung.com is my website. I've got a few things happening in 2025, but one of the ones I'm most excited about is I'm a State Library of Victoria fellow, a research fellow, and my topic that I have got funding for is researching spiritualism and mediumship and seances in Victorian-era Melbourne. Which is my bag. I love that stuff.
Yeah. I remember coming to a seance event that you organised one time, and it was quite spectacular. We'll all be watching out for what comes out of that research. That'll be quite exciting. So yes, please do look up both of our guests and follow them and find out more about them. They've been great sports, even though Liz beat us all at the game. And it's been great fun talking to you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you, listener, for tuning in and listening to a whole year or more of Pratchett, or maybe just this episode. Perhaps this is your first ever one. Bit of a weird choice, but hey, look, maybe you just listen to the latest one. Regardless, whether you've been here for one episode or 82 or 100 and whatever the total number is, including all the bonus episodes, thank you so much. I would just like to do a shout out here, not just to you, but also to one of our sibling Pratchett podcasts, The Truth Shall Make You Fret, who just this month, around the time we recorded this episode, put out their third and final episode about the Shepherd's Crown. Yes, they have made the journey all the way to the end of the Discworld series, and I think that's worth commemorating. Congratulations, Joanna and Francine. What an effort. You are I think if I've got this right, the 5th Discworld podcast to have read every single book in order. We will probably not be the 6th because we are probably going to go for at least another year, and we are still intending to make The Shepherd's Crown our last book. It is kind of a tradition, and it does kind of make thematic sense. But congratulations, Joanna and Francine, and to all the other podcasts who come before us, of course, and continue after us. One other bit of exciting Pratchett news. We don't put too much in here, but Mark Burrows, author of The Magic of Terry Pratchett and performer of The Magic of Terry Pratchett, and probably creator of something else called The Magic of Terry Pratchett. Anyway, he's bringing his one-man stage show version of his biography of Terry Pratchett to Australia, at least for the Adelaide Fringe Festival, which is in March. So watch out for dates there if you're going to be in Adelaide at that time. And if he's popping up in Melbourne for the Comedy Festival, well, we'll be sure to try and have him on the show, of course. But get along to the show in Adelaide if you can. Tickets are probably going to go on sale quite soon if they're not already, so keep an eye out for that. Look, next month we'll be back with an actual Discworld novel. Yes, it is an exciting event. There are not many left, but we will be reading Unseen Academicals with none other than returning guest Tansy Rayner Roberts. This is one I've been looking forward to, but it is also Pratchett's longest novel. So get a copy start reading it over the Christmas break because we are going to be talking about it for our January episode. The hashtag for that is Pratchett83 if you want to send us questions. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode, maybe you've got some board games to suggest, maybe you made a better sentence out of the words that I pulled out of the bag, you can see the list of all those words on our webpage in the episode notes so you can try your own hand at making the longest sentence possible. And maybe you've got some thoughts on CLACKS. If you have your own variant, we'd love to hear about it. If you've got thoughts about the other Discworld games, we will do an episode about the Ankh-Morpork board game, and who knows, we'll probably get to a few other things. But thank you for joining us. If you want to keep us going, make sure we make it to the end, then please consider supporting the podcast. You can give us a little one-off donation of money if you like. You can subscribe and get access to some bonus content. I'm hopefully going to put some more up there. I did some unboxing videos because I now have both versions of the CLACKS board game, so you can see what they both look like. Or you can just tell someone who you think would enjoy the show about it. That also helps us out immensely. But regardless, thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep your hands off my pegboard, you clacker! You've been listening to Pratchett, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast with Pratchetters Elizabeth Flux, Ben McKenzie, that's me, and guests Nicholas J. Johnson and Lawrence Leung. Pratchett is produced and edited by me on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Our music is by David Ashton. You can find us on social media as Pratchett or Pratchett Podcast, and you can listen to past episodes and support the production of new ones via pratchettpodcast.com. Join the conversation for this episode using the hashtag Pratchett82.
Pratchett is brought to you by Splendid Chaps Productions. We make entertainment for your ears, like the Doctor Who podcast Splendid Chaps and time travel comedy series Night Terrace. To find out more, visit splendidchaps.com.